Edition of News and Views, and I'm going to be leaving you with a moment that stopped the room. This was during the Pretoria leg of the hashtag Bring Aafia Home campaign, and it was headlined by Clive Stafford Smith, who's Afia's lawyer essentially. And there was a really, really wonderful moment where former Guantanamo Bay detainee and human rights advocate Moazzam Begg spoke with haunting clarity about life inside Bagram and the time that he spent at Guantanamo, and how the machinery of this indefinite detention and the enduring justice that he faced almost inspired him to be part of the hashtag Bring Back Aafia campaign, and Dr. Aafia Siddiqui's struggle also introduced by and we got also introduced by her lawyer, renowned human rights attorney Clive Stafford Smith, who we hosted quite graciously here at Salam Media. This was our campaign, and Moazzam Begg's words, man, they were. It was a wonderful speech. It was you can almost imagine, almost feel what he went through during those times, and how raw and unedited he was while speaking. It was very, very unsettling, but most importantly, it was impossible to ignore, because I think he brought into perspective what we thought we knew, but getting it firsthand from someone that was detained at Guantanamo Bay and what he went through. It was really, really eye-opening and enlightening. It was a very, very successful hashtag Bring Aafia Home campaign, proudly brought to you by Salam Media. And yeah, we're going to be closing off today's edition of News and Views with that moment from the Pretoria leg of the hashtag Bring Aafia Home campaign. And a really wonderful speech, a really wonderful talk by Moazzam Begg. If you're not there, if you couldn't make it to Pretoria, well, here's a bit of what you missed.
I pray Allah makes this gathering one that is of benefit for us on the day when we require that benefit to be manifest. I want to start by telling you a little story, and that is through Facebook. Once, it was around 2010 or so, I get a message, a private message from somebody who has as the image on Facebook a woman in a hijab. And she says, Assalamu alaikum. I say, Wa alaikum assalam. She said, brother, were you in Guantanamo? I said, yes, I was. She says, so was I. And I paused for a moment and thought, and then wrote, but sister, there were no prisoners, no female prisoners in Guantanamo. She said, I wasn't a prisoner, I was one of your guards. And I said, you're a Muslim? She said, I became a Muslim. And I said, why? She said, because this was the first time in my life I had encountered Muslims. And as a soldier, they had taken us as new recruits to Ground Zero, where the Twin Towers had fallen. And we were told and indoctrinated by the American military that the people you're going to guard are the most dangerous people on the planet. And what drives them is their faith in Islam. And so when I came here, I had my guard up. But then I saw the interactions between yourselves and with us. And by the time I left Guantanamo, I didn't hate Islam, I loved it. And I promised myself that once I get the opportunity for independent research, I will learn about this faith, and I did, and I embraced Islam as a result. Please send my salam to the brothers remaining in Guantanamo. And I wanted to begin with that because there were no female prisoners in Guantanamo, but there were female prisoners in Bagram. And I was held in Bagram in the prison there at the airbase run by the Americans for 1 year before I even got to Guantanamo. And in Bagram, in 2002, in May in particular, I was being interrogated by the CIA and the FBI and a whole host of American alphabet agencies. And in order to try to break my will, what they thought that they could, they tied me up. They tied my hands behind my back to my legs and put me in a cell a room, small little room, for a month. And during that time, amongst the things they subjected me to was the sounds of a woman screaming. Now, this wasn't the ordinary kind of screams of laughter or joy, or this were blood-curdling screams that echoed throughout the whole of the prison. Because you see, in Bagram, conversations were not allowed. You weren't allowed to talk to another prisoner. If you did, you'd be unceremoniously taken to the front of the cage and your hands tied above the top of the cage to your head and being suspended to the point at which all the weight is on your wrists. And so talking was not allowed. And every sound was extremely pronounced. Every sound, every decibel reached you. And nothing was more potent than the sounds of a woman screaming, because up until that point, nobody knew that there were any women in Bagram. Eventually, after being in Bagram for a year and then being transferred to Guantanamo, and then after Guantanamo coming back home, I started to look at what was that voice and who was that voice. And I came across the name Aafia Siddiqui. The Chibia woman had been disappeared. However, it happened in 2003, not 2002 when I was there. Meaning it couldn't have been Aafia Siddiqui unless somebody's got their dates terribly wrong. But it was somebody's wife. It was somebody's daughter. It was somebody's sister. It was somebody's aunt. There was a woman there. And what I learned, of course, afterwards is that there was a woman, not just taken to Bagram later, but actually a multitude of nations took part in the abuse of, in her abuse, and by extension, the abuse of her children, Suleiman, Maryam, and Ahmed. You're going to hear a lot more about them in terms of what happened to them. But suffice to say this: we as men, and what we endured in Guantanamo, so you're still aware, is still open. There are still 15 prisoners there, and the most prominent of them is a Palestinian stateless prisoner who has been compensated for the role of 4 European nations in his torture. So he's won 4 cases, and he remains in prison without charge or trial. A stateless Palestinian, if you want to understand the connection to and the abuse of the Palestinians that goes way back before October the 7th, look no further than Palestine. You will find case after case after case of the abuse of Palestinians. But we as men could endure certain amounts of physical torture, psychological torture, religious abuse. One of the things that Aafia talks about often is about the religious abuse and how that becomes in and of itself a tool to try to break you. Let's say they can't hurt you physically. Let's say they can't get to you through the sounds of a woman screaming that you might believe is your wife being tortured, as they did to me. But then they bring the Quran. And whilst the soldier may think this is just paper and ink, to the Muslim, regardless of whatever school of thought he follows, this is the unadulterated, pure speech of Allah, God. And if you desecrate that, if you spit on that, if you urinate on that, if you stamp on that, if you write curse words on that, then you have broken my soul and earned my animosity. And that was happening in the early days in Bagram. It happened in Guantanamo. And Aafia has witnessed it too. And the reason I know this is because I was handed over, so the Pakistani police and ISI, and not the police, the ISI and the CIA. On the night of the 31st of January 2002, they came to my house in Islamabad, where I had taken up residence after evacuating from Afghanistan, where I had lived with my wife and children. My wife was Palestinian at the time, and we were working on a project to build schools for girls in Taliban-administered Afghanistan. So when they knocked on my door in the middle of the night, they stormed in, no identification, no uniforms and put a gun to my head, threw me to the floor, tied my hands behind my back, tied my legs together, and put a hood over my head, and went into the room where my wife and children were asleep, and then they took me into the back of the vehicle. In the vehicle, they lifted the hood, and there's 2 CIA agents in the front wearing shalwar qameez. They weren't fooling anybody. But they said, you either answer our questions here or answer them in Guantanamo. And when this process happened, as I said, we'd gone through all of that. I eventually returned to Pakistan in 2010. And this time when I came with, some of you may know her, Yvonne Ridley, and some other people. And this time I wasn't unceremoniously taken away and beaten, stripped, and tortured. This time round, I was welcomed at the airport by Sister Aafia Siddiqui and her other family members, including Ahmed, who now, at that time, had been disappeared by the Americans for 6 years, was now free. And this time, I was talking to the Pakistanis about, and this time I went to Aafia Siddiqui's house, and I met with her mother, Ismat. She's passed away now. May Allah grant her Jannat al-Firdaus al-A'la and forgive her sins. But the case of Aafia Siddiqui hadn't even, it got massive momentum, but it hadn't got someone that had really grabbed the case, really taken the bull by the horns and said, I'm going to hold this case and I'm not going to let it go. And that, for me, is the connection that goes back to Guantanamo. It goes back to a time when I was held in solitary confinement. When I say solitary confinement, I mean you have no access to any other human being at all, not even for a Muslim Friday prayers or any prayers. No other human being other than the soldiers and the guards that you see, except for in the summer of 2004, I think it was the summer, a man is introduced to me by way of letter. And so I receive a letter through other lawyers, and the letter says, you are in good hands, because now lawyers have been, for the first time in 2.5 years, given access to the prisoners in Guantanamo, not because they're going to court, but because they will be able to challenge their detention somehow in the American courts. And this lawyer has been working on death row cases for the past 20 years in America. And when I saw that, I thought, why would I've never been charged with a crime, why would I need a death row lawyer? So I thought, excuse the pun, but I thought I'm screwed. And then, eventually, this man walks through and comes into my maximum security isolation cell, where I've been for I've been for around 2.5 years in total. And he brings a ream of documents. He's already been preparing. He's studied law of his life and defended all sorts of people accused of murder. But he hasn't dealt with this one before. He's never seen anything like this. He never studied this in law school. He never studied this in law school. And so he comes along, and he uses the legal term. He takes the ream of documents, and he slams them on the floor, on the table. He said, Moazzam, this crap is not going to work. We have to embarrass these, excuse my language, bastards. And that was the legal framework of how do you get people out of Guantanamo. And one of the things that I told Clive when I was there was my experience in Bagram. I told him in detail, painstaking detail. And so he writes a document. What is it, 1,000 days of torture? 1,000 days of torture, Moazzam Begg. And so time goes on. Eventually, the long story short, I get released and other people get released. And Guantanamo slowly, over 2 decades, out of 779 prisoners, there's only 15 left. And Clive represented around 87 of them, including me, the first. But that's not the almost unbelievable part of the story. Because who could have imagined? Last year, or was it the year before? The year before last. So Afghanistan, the wheels of fortune change. Afghanistan now falls back to the hands of the very people that ran it. And those people who were in prison with me now are running the country. And so, as a result of that, we are able to go to Afghanistan, and I go back where? Where do I go back to? I go back to Bagram, the place where I saw 2 prisoners murdered, beaten with their hands tied above their heads to the top of the cage, being punched and kicked to the point they were killed. And the report said that they found it amusing that the prisoner, because he was shouting Allah, Allah, every time he was punched and kicked, they found it amusing, so they did it over 200 times. So I'm back in this place, and I'm making a film with Al Jazeera. And we try to make a focus to release the last prisoner in Guantanamo who's from Afghanistan. And then I return again, this time with Clive. And we're walking the streets of a house where I used to live, the streets where we used to have the school. And most importantly, this time we don't go back for me. This time we go for Aafia. This time we want to know what happened to Aafia Siddiqui, the real story, not the made-up lies, fabricated stories put up about her. What we want now is eyewitnesses. As they say in Arabic, shuhud al-ayan, people who saw with their eyes, people who witnessed, who heard, who saw, who smelt, who felt. And this time round, we get one after the other after the other. It's like a tidal wave of eyewitnesses wherever we go. Cooperation wherever we go. And an understanding that regardless of whatever issues there may be between this country and that country, that this woman has been terribly, terribly, terribly wronged. And I'm just going to finish on this because it's extremely important to say this as a community here in South Africa. Mostly, where you go, say in Britain, in the United States of America, in Canada, obviously Pakistan, Afghanistan to some degree, that wherever there's a diaspora Pakistani community, you will naturally find people coming to the assistance and being concerned about the case of Aafia Siddiqui. South Africa, in my view, has always been different. There isn't a huge Pakistani community here, but the South Africans themselves, especially from the Muslim community, have been talking about this from day one and have been involved and concerned from day one. And if you were to go to other parts of the world, not that they don't know about her, but in some places in the Muslim world, they have no clue. They may have heard the name once and forgotten about it. You could go to many countries and that would be the case without naming any of them. And that's why I want to say with South Africa, it gives us a particular sense of hope that here in this country, because of what you've gone through yourself and a recognition of the not just injustice, but actually, arguably the most famous South African ever was somebody who was imprisoned for 27 years. Not because he was a criminal, but because he was criminalized.